I didn't actually have the opportunity to engage myself, Minister, at committee stage of the legislation, and I regret that I didn't have that opportunity. That being said, it is not the case that I haven't taken a keen interest in the passage and progress of this legislation, given the history of my own party in terms of the development of the initial bill that became the 2014 Act. And can I say, Deputy Buckley, I think very well articulated a lot of the concerns that have been expressed across this House about how the 2014 legislation may have been operated. The reality is that we have all of us in this House, dealt with and advocated for and represented those who have taken courage in their own hands to identify wrongdoing in organisations in which they work. And we all know that we want to have the best possible system in place to protect them when they go about that important business that is really intrinsic, I think you would agree, Minister, to our democracy and the functioning of our democracy. And to be fair to you, you in essence acknowledged that in the earlier part of your contribution. I may not have been in a position to make a contribution to the pre-legislative scrutiny process, but I certainly will be making a contribution on behalf of the Labour Party to committee and the latter stages of this bill as it progresses through these houses. I very much welcome the bill and the opportunity to speak on it on behalf of the Labour Party. The bill will see the transposition of the Whistleblowing Directive into Irish law, and this is, of course, a welcome development. It is worth noting again, as the Minister said earlier on, that Ireland is one of a minority of European Union states that has a set of legal protections in place to protect whistleblowers. The operation of the Protected Disclosures Act dates back to 2014 and was, as the House will be aware, one of a series of reform initiatives undertaken by my colleague Brendan Howlin when he occupied that ministry. And I think one of the most significant changes to the Act arising from the transposing of the directive will be the extension of the law as it relates to the requirement to establish clear reporting channels and procedures in private industry and private businesses. The public service was, of course, a good place to start in 2014. If you want to start, you start with the state and state-run services and supported services. But wrongdoing is as big a problem, if not a bigger problem, in the private sector as it is anywhere else. Anyone who uncovers a problem in a private sector body should have the same rights and processes available to those who are attached to the public sector, and there ought to be consistency in this regard. I don't think anybody would argue otherwise. No worker anywhere, regardless of where they work, should either fear penalisation if they have reported malpractice and so on. There should always be, as I say, consistency. Now, the new law, when passed, will make it mandatory for companies with over 50 staff to set up an internal mechanism and clear procedures to handle, progress and report on complaints. And this, of course, is a good thing. But the issue for me is what happens in organisations where there are fewer than 50 employees, and it has been referenced by other deputies previously. Now, I think, Minister, the response from the WRC to the public consultation is worth reflecting on. So, in essence, they reaffirmed that the protections available under the PDA do not distinguish between employment in large or small employments. The directive will require employers in all firms to accept, engage, provide feedback and follow up and so on a disclosure, and the need to have an internal reporting channel is, as they have said, consistent with that obligation. Now, I have a concern, Minister, around the absence of the requirement to have an internal reporting channel in smaller firms. Now, I do get the argument, and I'm assuming this is what the argument is, that this would place significant maybe administrative burdens on smaller business. I get that, I understand that. But I think a clear reporting mechanism would help everyone, in my view, in all circumstances, regardless of firm size. Now, smaller firms may operate, of course, more informally, and this runs the risk then of a threat to the confidentiality of a disclosure, regardless of where the disclosure might be made. It might be made to an external body, but given the nature of how things operate, we all understand that, there is a risk certainly that things get out and confidentiality then becomes a problem, and then penalisation and victimisation becomes a problem. So the Minister might take another look at that particular question when we get to committee stage, the committee stage consideration of this bill. Now, what is really welcome is the provision for tighter and clearer timeframes on the progressing of protected disclosures and the investigation of them. I mean, time and again, Minister, and I'm sure it's the case for you as well, we've all been contacted by whistleblowers with active cases, concerned that their cases are going around in circles or are going nowhere at all. Now, they fear then that the system is circling the wagons, protecting itself, as systems do, and hoping that by stringing things along, by stringing out a complaint, that the complainant, or disclosure I should say in these circumstances, that the complainant will go away, that they will become exhausted and frustrated, and they will simply fold up their tent. Now, people take a huge risk when they draw attention to wrongdoing, and you're aware of this, we're all aware of this. It can take an enormous personal toll, an absolutely enormous personal toll. Now, I am to a degree somewhat encouraged by some of the research that suggests that it is a minority of workers who have blown the whistle who have experienced detrimental impacts. It might be a minority of workers, but it is a significant minority of workers. And we know that from work undertaken by Transparency International and others. Now, one worker who experiences a detrimental impact is one worker too many, and while we can never achieve perfection, we should always strive to have the best possible system in place, and the system should always seek to properly support, protect and embrace complainants and those who are bringing forward protective disclosures. We've all of us worked with and represented far too many brave and courageous people who have put themselves at great risk to tell the truth and expose wrongdoing. People have been victimised, targeted and traumatised as they have stood up to an often unforgiving system. And that's one of the important reasons why clear timeframes on reporting, follow-up feedback and communication of the outcome of an investigation is so important. It's absolutely crucial to public confidence and the utility of the system, and the idea that if you make a complaint, it will be handled properly, it will be handled transparently, and it will be handled in a timely fashion. And I think these new reforms and these new provisions will provide, I think, some comfort to those who may wish to make protected disclosures in the future. It's good as well to see that there will be a clear requirement on competent authorities to publish clear and straightforward information on their websites around the protections afforded to disclosures, around details on how reports are handled and progressed, and indeed the remedies available to whistleblowers against retaliation, and the fact that confidential advice is also available to people who are often in very difficult circumstances. Those who do take their courage into their hands and disclose information motivated by a sense of what is right should be, as I said earlier, embraced and properly supported by the system. Now, I know too that some of the more subtle ways in which employees can be penalised by their employer for blowing the whistle, as it were, are now to be included in new definitions of penalisation. That's in the directive. Significantly, as you said earlier on, Minister, with the burden of proof resting on the employer. So it will be the case when this legislation passes that where a person takes a case to the WRC or indeed to the courts in relation to penalisation for making a protected disclosure, that the burden of proof clearly falls on the employer. So in simple terms, the authorities will work on the assumption that the alleged act of penalisation, say blacklisting or ostracism, took place because the worker involved made a protected disclosure, and unless and until the employer can prove to the contrary. This again, I think, will provide some important reassurance to those who have information they may want to report and disclose. I would also welcome, Minister, the fact that, as per the directive, the coverage of the Act, if I can use that term, is being extended to volunteers, to board members of organisations, to job applicants, to shareholders. They will have an important role, as they have, for example, in company law, and it's really important that they come under the scope of this legislation, and they will so for the first time in the context of these new proposed laws. In terms of Protected Disclosures Office under the remit of the Office of the Ombudsman, I think that is a very positive development. I always struggle myself to understand how ministers and officials can properly investigate and interrogate complaints that may be made or disclosures that might be made through their departments. It is important that there is an independent voice here and an independent channel that can investigate and expedite the consideration of complaints. I think far too often it was the case, often by accident and not by design, that there may have arisen conflicts of interest in departments. A protected disclosure may be made to a minister. We don't ultimately know who is investigating this in the department, and the reality is that confidentiality then can often become a problem, and people feel then that they become victimised and targeted and are kind of re-traumatised, having been traumatised in the first place because of what they may have experienced, what they might have seen in a department or an agency attached to a department. So it's really important that there is an independent means by which a complaint can be investigated and handled. That's so important for the integrity of this process and for public confidence in it. I'm looking forward to working with you, Minister, on committee stage. I think you are sincere. I know you are sincere in terms of agreeing to work with members who may have legitimate concerns and ideas that may be better interrogated at committee stage in order to improve the robustness of the legislation. This is a significant piece of work, and I want to extend my gratitude to your officials as well, because I know the levels of work that will go into the transposition of a directive of this nature. It is vast, and we want to get it right. And Ireland has, objectively speaking, a good record. We were one of the first European Union member states to agree to legislate to protect the interests of whistleblowers through the 2014 PDA, Protected Disclosures Act. Like all pieces of legislation, it needs to evolve. It was of its time, I think, as you said earlier on. We've learned a lot, I think, through our own lived experience, to use that term, of how the Act operates, experiences that we have with our own constituents and others, and experiences you and your departmental officials will have in terms of the operation of the Act. So it is useful that we have put all of that experience in here. I think it can be improved significantly if you will consider some of the points that I made, Minister. We will be seeking to amend the legislation when it gets to committee stage on the basis of the proposals that I made and the areas that I covered in my remarks, and we do look forward to working with you, because this is, as I said at the outset, intrinsic to the operation of our democracy and confidence in our democracy. We know the impact that brave whistleblowers have had in terms of being agents of change in this country, identifying wrongdoing, identifying systemic problems that ought to be rooted out and where change is needed to be delivered. People like Garda Morris McCabe have done the state some service. This House and ministers, previous governments and this government have recognised that, and I think we owe to him and we owe to others who have taken brave stances in terms of wrongdoing to get this legislation right and to have a world-class best practice system in place in our country to protect the interests of those who stand up to be counted. Thank you.
Margaret, your brevity has created a slight problem. We're going to move on slowly. There are a number of slots here if people are watching the screen. The next slot is government. The next slot is there's nobody here just yet for the government slot. So the next slot is a 3-minute slot for Sinn Féin. Not sure if there's anybody here. Okay, so we'll move on. I won't list out all the slots. That's okay. We're going to move on here. I won't read them all out. We're moving on to the government slot again, where there's a name. The regional group has a different Deputy Fitzpatrick. You won't. Yeah, you can. Yeah. Are you sharing that time?
But Deputy Tubby.
Yeah. Just to forewarn you, I'll be interrupting you to move an adjournment because the debate has to close at 5:26. So you'll get to start and then I'll be interrupting.
Yeah. That's Conor. I very welcome the opportunity to speak today. First of all, I would like to thank the deputies for bringing this motion to the House. I welcome the fact that we can discuss the housing crisis once more and discuss why we're in this position. Now, my hometown of Dundalk, rental cost of standard 3-bedroom homes anywhere is between £1,200 and £1,600 per month. Minister, I'm telling you, Monday and Fridays my clinics, the queues outside the door is unreal trying to find property. To service the mortgage on the same property will be substantially less. But the
Sure what you're reading there, but this is in relation to the Protected Disclosures Act.
oh, is that even the wrong one then?
That's okay, that's all right. My own attention wandered till it was pointed out to me, but if you want to, let me see, is there anyone coming here in relation to the Social Democrats? Are you ready to speak? And no? Okay, well I'll go back to give people a chance because there are just a few minutes left, so I'm going back again. Government slot, the various parties. I'm going to have to close this debate if someone doesn't show very soon in relation to this matter. The regional group, Sinn Féin. In fairness, I know there are committees going on and that, so I'm going to hold on just for a minute or two. We're almost finished anyway, but I know people want to make a contribution. It's a very important topic. 3 or 4 minutes left. We're going to be moving straight on to the private members. Minister, you're not taking that, the next one, you're not? No. So we're going to be moving on shortly, if members are watching, to the private members' business, tackling the cost of living. Not sure what minister is taking that. And we'll be moving straight on to that, and that will conclude within 2 hours. So we're almost there, so I'm going to ask Deputy Farrell to move an adjournment of this till tomorrow.
Adjourn until tomorrow.
Garmog. Thank you, Minister.
Thank you. Thank you.
Private members' business motion re tackling the cost of living institutional investors in the residential property market. Sinn Féin module dolingle leis an gustas maragtala in estori institutoka so warga muena coniha. So I have the Pierre Starty.
Can
you move the motion?
I move the motion on behalf of the Sinn Féin TDs. Workers and families are in the grip of a cost of living crisis. Low and middle income households needed actions that met the scale of those challenges. And a government that understood the challenge they faced, a government that responded to support them. But as we know, this government doesn't get it and failed to meet that challenge. The package announced last week will see the government ministers receiving the same financial support to heat and light their homes as a worker on the minimum wage. That's crazy. This government will spend over €12 million on electricity credits to more than 62,000 holiday homes throughout the state, while low and middle income households face price spikes in the cost of gas, electricity and home heating oil. This is a government that is out of touch, out of ideas and out of time. A Sinn Féin government would have provided targeted support to low and middle income households at speed and at scale. This government has failed to respond to the challenge. The failure is no more evident than in the area of housing. This Dáil and this government should be constantly reminded that the housing and rental crisis did not fall from the sky. It didn't happen by accident, but as a direct consequences of the policies and decisions made by Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael elected representatives. Ministers, some of whom have been at the cabinet table now for over a decade, often comment on the housing crisis as if they're some type of spectator. But they are key players in the housing crisis, and you can't spin reality. In the 12 months to November, house prices rose by 14%, and we are close to reaching what I believe is the objective, and has been the objective of this government for the past decade, and that is to push house prices back up to Celtic Tiger peaks, to pump up the housing market, to maximise its proceeds for shareholders, developers and institutional investors. And the problem that the government now faces is that that policy has now damaged the quality of life and life prospects of renters while locking workers and families out of home ownership. The average rent now stands across the state at €1,500, and in Dublin it stands at over €2,000. And that is the legacy of this government. Indeed, Minister Donoghue, that is your legacy as Minister for Finance. Renters struggling in this city and right across the state. Saving for a deposit while paying extortionate rent is impossible, while house prices seem so far beyond the reach of many. The October budget, like the measures announced last week, ignored and forgot the struggles of renters. Sinn Féin have called for rents to be reduced and then frozen. A Sinn Féin government would introduce a refundable tax credit for renters, putting 1 month's rent back into their pockets. And a Sinn Féin government would ban rent increases, because renters cannot afford another rent increase. While the government continue to ignore the struggle of renters and home buyers, on the other hand, they roll out the red carpet to institutional investors, to these vulture funds and cuckoo funds, providing them with tax advantages that encourage them to price home buyers out of the market and to push up rents. They pay no corporation tax on their rental profits. They pay no capital gains tax when they sell the property. And they are the winners of government policy, while renters and home buyers are certainly the losers. In 2019, real estate funds enjoyed an operating profit of €1.2 billion. And they did not pay a cent in corporation tax on those profits. And that's not a mistake, I've somehow said. Real estate funds in 2019 enjoyed an operating profit of €1.2 billion, and they didn't pay a cent of corporation tax on those profits. In the first half of last year, IRES REIT, which owns over 3,800 properties across the state, made profits of €27 million. They didn't pay a red cent of corporation tax on any of those profits. Profits that were made on the back of renters paying sky-high rents. Now, for years, Sinn Féin have warned this government, have warned this minister across the table that the sweetheart tax deals that he granted these funds would undermine the efforts and interests of renters and of buyers. And that has come to pass, Minister. And now is the time for change. It is long overdue. So this motion before this House tonight calls on the Government once again to end the tax advantage that they deliberately gift to the investment funds in the housing market, and instead fund and empower local authorities and home buyers to purchase homes that can be bought or rented at affordable prices. That is what a Sinn Féin government do, and even at this late stage, that is what Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael should do. Roll up the red carpet and stop allowing these funds to pay no tax.
Thank you, Minister. Institutional investors are distorting our housing market, and this isn't some accident or force of nature. It is the policy of your government. For many years, there has been a global wall of cheap money seeking out the highest yields in real estate investment. And what government policy has done in recent years is thrown fuel on the housing fire with all of the obvious consequences. My colleague Pearse Doherty has talked about how there's no tax on the rent roll for these funds, no tax on capital gains, and in fact, in many cases, they can write off their dividend withholding tax against other costs. And at the same time, we have inferior design standards for apartments. Why renters should have any less of a standard than buyers is beyond me. But we're also seeing increasingly poor decisions by developers, by the board, challenged in the courts with further delays. And the consequence? House prices rise, rents rise, buyers are locked out of the market, and the housing crisis goes on and on and on. And the measures that you took last year simply make no difference. The idea that an increase of 8% stamp duty would make it more difficult for funds to buy houses and duplexes ignores what's happening with rents. And of course, we remind you time and time again that apartments are also homes, and what we really need here is to price these high-yield short-term investors out of the market and replace them with public investment, with good quality private sector investment to deliver genuinely affordable homes for working people. The Minister will, of course, wrongly say that Sinn Féin is against private sector investment in the market. That is not the case. What we are against is the bad investments that are pushing up house prices, locking families out of home ownership and making the delivery of social and affordable homes ever more difficult. And the motion before us today presents very clear policy alternatives. Because ultimately, Minister, it's time to make a choice. Are you on the side of small numbers of poorly regulated institutional investors to make maximum profits, or are you on the side of the delivery of genuinely affordable homes for working people to rent or buy at prices they can afford? That's the difference between our party and yours, and that's why we will propose this motion today and you will oppose it.
This time last month, the City Tribune carried a story and they reported that a vulture fund, and not just any vulture fund, but the country's largest one, was circling above my home county of Galway. And the Tribune stated, and I quote, that Oireachtas REIT was planning to roll out its highly profitable buy-to-let model, a move that will drive up rents and house prices. Minister, this news wasn't welcomed by anyone who came into my clinic. These are people who are struggling to pay rent, people who've seen just this last week that rents have increased yet again by 19% in County Galway and by 8.8% in Galway City. People fear bills coming through the door. These are people who are served notices to quit by landlords and fear where they're going to go to next. The build-to-rent model of these investment firms just drive up rents and prices, and they're there to serve only the wealthiest in society. And we often hear from this government that it's all about supply, 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 that so long as we're increasing the supply of homes by whatever means, then we can bring down rents. But we know and we've seen that funds are more than happy to let their properties sit idle if they cannot get someone to pay that rent, because they don't want to allow a situation of falling rents, which for them means a falling yield on their asset, and they're happy to maintain a situation of high rents. And Minister, just a few months ago, right outside where I live, right outside my estate in Merview in Galway, one of these build-to-rents was given planning permission for apartments to be constructed just outside of Merview. And I tell you, Minister, the people of Merview were not happy to see that, because once again, the people of Merview will know and they will see that their children, their grandchildren will not benefit from this. They will not be able to pay those rent, and it will just push them further away from home ownership and indeed from even being able to rent. The reality is that your housing policy is destroying generations of young people and older people. And when I hear your ministers telling us that your housing policy is working, I have to say I don't disagree with them. But for me, the operational question is, who exactly is it working for? Who is it benefiting? And that answer, Minister, is these investment funds and the large private developers that are serving them. Because our rental crisis and the rental crisis of the people of Galway is their record profits.
Minister, nothing that your government has done has had any impact whatsoever on rising rents. And of course, rising rents aren't just unique to our larger cities and towns. In my own constituency, rents up in County Roscommon by over 22% in the last year. On average now, renters paying €912 and rising every single month. At the same time, every other outgoing in that house has increased as well. In County Galway, 19% increase in rents. They're now surpassed €1,100, with renters paying €1,138 a month and rising. And the government response to this consistently is supply. But renters cannot wait for supply, and they especially cannot wait when the supply is there and an investment fund comes in, takes it up, and that supply is gone. Young people, people of my generation, cannot save a deposit to own their own home. They're now leaving, as they have done previously, because they cannot afford to live in Ireland, and that's a reality. And they are in a position now where they don't want to work just to live. They don't want to work just to pay their rent and pay their bills. They actually want a life. They're young people, they're coming out of college, they're starting work, and we are driving them out of this state, as we have done before. It's not working. It's a sad indictment in 2022 that so many people cannot afford to live in this state. They have good jobs, they're well educated, and they cannot get by. That doesn't make any sense. And what your government have done to date in relation to rents has had no impact whatsoever. We have to support these renters to allow them to work and to live here rather than to leave, like many of my generation have already and unfortunately continue to.
Louise O'Reilly.
There is a cost of living crisis, and it is absolutely hammering low to middle income workers. It's like we keep saying it, but you just cannot hear it, or you hear it and you just don't get it, or you maybe get it but you're not interested in doing anything about it. But you really need to listen and to engage with the opposition minister when we are putting forward solutions. In my own constituency in Fingal, workers are paying more than £2,000 a month to rent a 3-bedroom property in which they are trying to bring up their families, pay for the exorbitant cost of childcare, try to keep a car on the road because, well, you know, public transport is not quite what it should be out my direction. And all they see is prices rising all around them, a secure home getting further and further and further away from them. And they see that that is government policy. And government policy is working, because government policy appears to be to heap more and more pressure onto the backs of ordinary workers until they simply cannot take it anymore. And Minister, I don't know what you see in your clinics or who you see, but in mine, I see people every day of the week who are absolutely desperate for secure housing, and they see your government putting it further and further and further away from them. When I was young Minister, the aspiration of owning a home was not fantastic. It wasn't something that was a pipe dream. It was very achievable for people on ordinary incomes. It isn't. And if that isn't enough for you to realise now that workers are paying the rents that you are ensuring they have to pay, they cannot save for deposits, they are stuck renting, they cannot get out of the rental trap, and the rent is going up and up and up, week on week, year on year, and it is crucifying them.
Minister, this is an ideologically driven housing policy which is not only facilitating the institutional and investment funds, they are in fact being subsidised by the state. to the tune of 860 million every year and more. For decades now, your party and Fianna Fáil have undermined the local authorities and young people's ability to rent, to purchase or to build or to live locally. These institutional landlords are in fact competing with the council and with against young couples in trying to purchase homes, to ensure that families live locally, that they can contribute locally, rather they're producing, with your say-so and with your support, build to rent, which creates transitional, transient communities. It's not a stable society. There is so much state land that can be used also that needs to be built on. In my own area, there's quite a range, and we've told you time and time again. And in fact, in some cases, you have rezoned it back to industrial rather than to be used for housing. Such as the chaotic state of your policies. That needs to be built on, and if you started building for young families, for couples, for those who want to rent, affordable rate, then you will allow families to take the burden off their shoulders. We have to ensure that young people, young working families in Dublin City and elsewhere can afford to put a roof over their heads. It is not the case today that they can. Even today, for instance, in Dublin 10, there is not one property available to rent in that part of my constituency. And it's not much better in Dublin 12, where there's only 19 properties. That's because the institutional landlords and the investment funds are buying up properties, sometimes in groups or sometimes in just one here and one there. And I see you shaking your head. That is a fact. Whether you like it or not, I can bring you to places where they have bought up whole blocks of houses, but where they've also bought up ex-local authority stock, second-hand ones, on the market, competing and driving up the price of those houses, and then changing them into rental properties and driving up the prices also, and then you're subsidising them. That's the scandal, and that needs to end.
The government's failure to adequately address the housing crisis, a crisis of their own creation, has meant that other unsavoury actors have entered the housing market and act with impunity. A classic example is the aptly named Vulture Funds, who swoop into our distressed housing market to look for and buy out housing stocks and portfolios. Investment funds have the advantage of not being subjected to the same constraints as the banks. They have little or no concern at the backlash or negative consequences their actions have on their company's branding, so they are more inclined and more likely to take drastic action to protect their investments. This can mean repossessing homes and evicting people. These companies have one goal, which is to be profitable, and they achieve this by protecting their investments, whether by offering those with a homeowner a write-down or evicting them. The banks win when they sell their loan books to investment funds, because their reputations are not tarnished by being the one who has to evict a homeowner, and they don't like having to offer write-downs to individual mortgage holders, as others on their books with distressed loans might look for a similar resolution to their repayment difficulties. The Vulture Fund does not have these concerns and can do either with a view to what is in the best interests of its investors, despite the enormous damage such investment funds do to Irish society by locking out those seeking to buy a home and forcing renters into paying unaffordable rents. The government is happy to let this continue regardless of the social and economic costs to the country, as long as they can say that housing is available. Vulture Funds buying up large blocks of housing and apartments creates its own monopoly of sorts. These investment funds will be the market drivers, and they will have the leverage by their ownership of vast numbers of apartments and houses in determining market prices. House prices will be and are being driven by these tactics and are no longer affordable, or even to professionals who take in home incomes which are above the national average. This is not sustainable, and we need to ensure that in new housing developments, institutional investment funds are themselves locked out of purchasing in bulk by imposing a stamp store surcharge and ending tax exemptions granted by the government. Minister, you're aware that in your own constituency, there beside Campbell's Bridge, there's a huge 15-storey building which has been bought up by an investment fund. So it would be ridiculous to say that you're not aware of what's going on. Thank you.
Thank you
very much, Orla, and I wish to move a counter motion on behalf of the Government in relation to the motion this evening. And I want to open up by stating very clearly whose side I'm on this evening, given the allegations that Sinn Féin have made. When I am in my constituency, meeting constituents, of course, I experience at first hand the great concern they have regarding the rising cost of rent. I experience families who come to meet me who are worried about it. Will they be able to buy a home? Will they be able to afford their rent in the future? These are issues, challenges that are affecting so many that I absolutely understand the effect it is having their lives, the effect it is having in our society, and the obligation and the need on behalf of this government to respond back and to make a difference. But when I'm meeting my constituents on the grave challenges they're confronting in their own lives, I also see in my own constituency, for example, Devaney Gardens, a huge housing project that is being built, that was opposed by Sinn Féin. It is being built at the moment with more homes to come on this site, providing a mix of different forms of homes in private ownership, in public ownership, to meet the very needs, the very issues that I encounter when I meet constituents, when I encounter across the country. That is a project that is happening. I go to Dominic Street. I see the new accommodation, the new apartments that are being built by Dublin City Council that will be open soon, that will families will be living in them in accommodation that they deserve, that will be affordable to them. I look elsewhere in my constituency. I look at the scale of new apartments that are being built now at the bottom of Carnlough Road in Cabra. New homes that are being built that, of course I know, want more homes to be built quickly, but these are projects that are underway that will have families within them, that will be alleviating the grave challenges that so many are now confronting. But beyond this tale of individual projects being built, there is the reality that if we look at where we are now, with homes being built within our country at the moment, while I know more needs to be done, I want more homes to be built quickly. If you look at where we were over the last 12 months, we've seen, despite the impact of COVID on our construction sector, over 20,000 homes being built in our country. We've over 30,000 homes being commenced in our country over the last 12 months, and we've over 39,000 homes in planning permission. And behind every one of those figures is a house, an apartment that will turn into a home, that will have a citizen, a family, a worker living within it. And this government is determined to repeat this year by year, to make a sustainable and real difference to the challenges that are behind this motion here, but are not served by the motion that has been put forward. So let's look at the reality of the scale of institutional investment within our country at the moment. At the moment, they're 1% of the total housing stock of our country. They're 7% of total tenancies within our country, rising to, I accept, just under 15% within Dublin. So that's the total amount of accommodation at the moment that these funds are associated with. But if you look at the delivery that I refer to at the moment that is underway, what is behind that is a government commitment of €4 billion per year that will this year alone deliver well in excess of 6,000 to 7,000 new social homes for those who need them. Those homes will be available this year. That will also deliver new homes being built for affordable rent and for cost purchase. That is the reality of what is happening this year behind the government recognising the challenges that so many face. So when Sinn Féin ask me whose side am I on, that's whose side I'm on. The reason why I want to see additional supply within our country, the reason why I want to see more homes being built within our country, the reason why the state is investing, because it needs to, because it's a role in doing it, €4 billion this year, is because the people whom this government is on the side of is those who want homes that they can afford to live in, that they can afford to buy, that they can afford to rent. And we accept that we are doing this in the context of where many are facing very intense and very difficult challenges. But that is why we're responding back with the scale of funding that is underway, and that is why we have the Land Development Agency that will play an active role in it, and that is leading into the figures that I shared with the Dáil at the moment ago. Over 20,000 homes built, over 39,000 homes in planning permission, over 30,000 homes commenced. And I know, as I say this, Last Count Corla, so many want these homes delivered now, so many want more of these homes available now at a cheaper price and a cheaper rent. But in order to complete that journey, in order to get to that point, what we do need to see is more homes being built in our country year after year after year, and that's what this government is committed to doing. But as we do it, it's not just the government that has a role to play within this. According to analysis prepared by my own department, per year we need around €10 billion worth of private investment and private capital in our country to get up to the 35,000 homes that we need to be delivering each year. And per year at the moment, that figure is around €6 billion. So we have a gap at the moment of around €4 billion per year that needs to be filled to deliver the new homes for the people that I'm representing and this government is aiming to serve. And that addresses, and that is coming on to the role that institutional investment can play in our country in meeting that need. As I said a moment ago, the scale of total accommodation that they have is, as I've shared with the Dáil, but at the heart of these investment funds is the role that they can play to our country in allowing us to organise savings that are held elsewhere in the world to deliver more housing supply in our country. That is at the heart of what these investment funds and entities do. And I heard again and again members of Sinn Féin say that they play a role in buying up a housing stock that is already built. And I do accept when that happens, that is something that is an issue. That is why we brought in the surcharge that we did last year in relation to the bulk purchase of homes. But my contention to the Dáil here this evening is what those funds play a critical role in doing is providing supply into our country of new homes, new apartments and new housing. And in the absence of these funds, that supply would not be coming in. That supply wouldn't be available in our country in the scale that it is. And that is the role these funds, these investors can play, accompanied by a government that is spending €4 billion with a capital budget that is at an all-time high, a strong and active state directly investing to build more homes itself through our local authorities, with a role for the private sector too. If you look at the number of social housing that the government is aiming to commit across this year, in 2022 we expect that will be over 10,000 new social homes. And that is existing beside the role of these funds in particular, providing rental accommodation, in the absence of which, of these funds operating in the way they are, it is our judgment and our contention that the majority of these homes would not be built. So that's the equation. More supply to, over time, lead to more homes being built in our country, which over time will give us the best prospect that we have, and doing so as quickly as we can, of addressing the issues we have in affordability, addressing the issues that we have in rent, in conjunction with the state directly building homes itself through our local authorities. And the issues that are being brought forward here by Sinn Féin, the proposals that they are bringing forward, I believe would lead to fewer homes being built and would lead to higher rent, higher prices. That's what I believe this is a recipe for. And when a Sinn Féin spokespeople and others make the point regarding their ambitions to deliver more social homes, the figures in relation to it are stark. They claim they can build 20,000 social homes next year at a cost of €3 billion. That's the cost of €150,000 per home. That's what the maths are. We know you cannot deliver €150,000 homes at the moment in our state because of the very issues that indeed they are raising around cost inflation, around the pressure that we're facing and many are facing in relation to inflation for the materials that are needed to deliver these homes. But Count Corla, the case that I am making, the case that the government is making here, is that we are playing an active role, building homes directly, creating the conditions which we will see more private supply, which in turn will create the environment in which we will be able to continue to make progress on the issues that renters, that homeowners are raising regarding the cost of living, the cost of their rent, the cost of their ability to own a home. That's whose side I'm on. That's whose side Deputy Durkin is on. Others will be on from the government benches who will be speaking on this motion here this evening, and that is why we're putting forward this counter motion.
Sinn Féin,
Insurance bodies don't pay any tax.
The clock is running.
Minister, the policy of inviting and incentivising investment funds into the Irish housing market has been disastrous for a generation of young people in Ireland. People are in the ridiculous position of trying to compete with investment funds who can come in, swoop in and buy up hundreds or even thousands of homes at inflated prices. This is pushing up the price of housing and contributing to the current shameful situation where for many young people owning a home is nothing but a pipe dream. Fine Gael and Labour introduced a system that brought these investment funds into the Irish market, awarding them, frankly, outrageous tax advantages and exemptions, including not having to pay corporation tax on income earned from rent. And this has contributed to the dysfunctional, cruel housing market that we have now. It has locked out people struggling to buy their own home, and it's fuelling higher rents. And so here we are, nearly a decade on, dealing with the repercussions of this terrible policy decision. In 2022, working people are finding it almost impossible to house themselves in a way that is affordable and sustainable. People who earn decent pay, who in previous generations would never have struggled to buy a home, are now not able to do so. And we all know why people so badly want to own their own home, because the rental market is absolutely bonkers. Rents are astronomical. They're increasing month on month, year on year, and there's no stability or security of tenure for anybody. And that's if you can find a place to rent. DAF recently reported that the number of properties available for rent is the lowest since they began tracking in 2006. In Louth, rents increased by over 8% in the last year alone. We need to make housing affordable, Minister, and we need to allow our young people to live their lives without the enormous worry and stress of paying for housing hanging over them. Young people aren't able to live normal lives. Living with your parents well into your 20s and 30s isn't normal, nor is it fair, Minister. People are putting off getting married and having children, and of course, many are leaving the country altogether, not because they're unemployed, but because successive governments have made it impossible for them to live here. And Minister, I just can't fathom how you, in all conscience, can continue with these policies, knowing the damage, the stress, the sheer anxiety and the huge financial pressure and burden it's putting on your own people. And most people outside of this bubble are asking you the same question. Why continue with those policies?
Deputy Funch, no. Deputy Crowe and then Deputy Stanley, according to the list I have here.
Minister, you and I know that investment funds are currently spending billions in the Irish property market, and they are hoovering up properties. We also know that workers and their families are locked out of the market and don't stand a chance when some big fund can just buy properties in bulk and offer 30% over the asking price. Minister, it's obscene that big funds pay hardly any tax and are making huge profits at the expense of Irish people. And why is this happening? Because Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael have prioritised the profits of investment funds and developers. Let the market decide. Let it run amok with no controls. And who are the victims? It's young couples who come into our advice centres. its young workers, its nurses, its guards, council workers, civil servants, factory workers. The government has made their priorities clear, and they're skewed as all the others towards a wealthy elite. The government measures and plans only ever push up the costs of homes, meaning that many workers and their families will be trapped in the rental market. And if this continues, homelessness will increase as more and more workers' incomes flows into rents. Rents and house prices climb and do serious harm to lone parents and others who are disproportionately represented among the homeless and hidden homeless population. And does anyone seriously believe that the same parties that created the mess will somehow, with a magic wand, go and fix it? I do not believe that anyone trusts Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael to solve the housing problems. Every so-called plan we've seen from this government and previous governments were just another developer's charter. Sinn Féin would end tax breaks for big investment funds, will ensure that local authorities and approved housing bodies are funded to buy some of these developments before they come onto the market, so they can make them available to ordinary people to rent and buy at affordable prices. The housing situation in Ireland is completely dysfunctional. Sinn Féin are committed to building social and affordable housing, implementing rent controls and putting a month's rent back in renters' pockets through a tax credit. So it's time for others to be given a chance to do things differently.
Now, Deputy Gould.
Minister, Taoiseach, a Corkman like myself has repeatedly tried to play down the damage that is being done by international investment funds in this state by claiming it's only a Dublin issue. It is not only a Dublin issue. My constituents and his own in Cork are having the hopes and dreams of owning their own home dashed by these funds coming in and buying up properties and homes. CSO figures released in October show that in Cork, 1 in 5 Cork City homes are being purchased by non-owner occupiers. Given the state of the housing market, given the out-of-control rents, with an average rent in Cork at the moment of over €1,500 per month, ordinary families and working people don't stand a chance of ever owning their own home while you're in power. The Examiner reported in 2020 that the previous 5 years, institutional investment funds spent over €1 billion in Cork alone. The largest of these being the Elysian building, which cost $90 million in the centre of Cork City. To rent the 3-bedroom apartment, Minister, in the Elysian, you pay an eye-watering €3,448. To pay that a month, and if you were to stay with the recommended of 30% of your income towards your rent, you'd want to earn $250,000. That's the type of housing policy that you've had that's led us to here. Minister, we talk about cuckoo funds, but the only thing about cuckoo funds is your policy, because you must be in cuckoo land if you think this will deliver more housing and cheaper rents.
Thanks, Minister, listen carefully to what you have to say, but the reality is thousands of workers are trapped in private rented accommodation with spiralling rents and no hope of ever getting a mortgage or securing a permanent roof over their heads. Daft.ie figures released last week revealed that rents in Laois went up by 11.3% in 12 months, while Noffield went up by a whopping 14.6%. And the average purchase cost of a home in 2021 was $225,000. The government has completely abandoned renters and workers earning in the category of 18 to 60,000 in terms of being able to either buy a home or secure a home with secure tenure tenancies. The government budget and the recent announcement delivered no solutions to these housing problems. You fail renters and you fail rural dwellers. Sinn Féin has long called for an immediate rent freeze that we would introduce and provide renters with a tax rebate to the value of 1 month. So give the renters a break. Don't give it to the institutional investors. Why not give it to our own people, to the people who are nailed to the wall absolutely nailed to the wall every week and every month trying to figure out where they're going to get the rent. Give them a modest tax break of 1 month's rent back every year. Workers and families need that break, and these two measures would provide some relief, but would also help renters to save for a deposit. And Minister, government spokespersons put a lot of faith in increasing the supply of housing. We want to increase the supply of housing. I know it needs to be increased, but the facts is that increasing supply alone will not bring down rents and will not bring down the price of housing. And all we have to do is look back to 2006 and 2007 when we were building over 90,000 homes a year. What happened? Rents went out to the roof, literally, pardon the pun, and the same with house prices in those 2 years. So supply alone won't do it. It needs other measures. And government, our proposal this evening also calls for an increase in stamp duty and take away the incentives for these vulture funds to buy up bulk buy homes that ordinary families and couples need. End their tax breaks, Minister. Workers and families, and just add this, workers and families in rural Ireland are also facing huge energy costs, and the measures you brought in last week didn't address this. All they're facing is more carbon tax increases in areas where there isn't public transport. And you know, really and truly here what you're doing is that you've really done nothing to address the situation for renters and rural dwellers.
Now, Deputy Jed Nash, please.
Thank you very much, I welcome the opportunity to speak on this motion on behalf of the Labour Party. Minister, you know that we are now in the midst of a real cost of living crisis, but the reality is that we have faced an affordability crisis in our housing and rental market for far, far longer. Now, over the past year alone, we've seen house prices in Louth experience double-digit growth, with young couples, those from places like Drogheda, Dundalk, Laytown, Bettystown and Eastmeath and all across the constituency, just unable to settle down close to their family, to their friends and their wider support networks. And they, like people across the country, remain caught in a vicious cycle of not being able to find an affordable home while being caught in a dysfunctional rental system that continues to eat up their weekly wage cheque and savings. Rents in Louth, for example, are now well in excess of double what they were during the last recession, with average rents in the county now standing at just under €1,400 per month, and the situation is much more acute in the Drogheda area. Average rental prices in Louth are now an astonishing 118.7% higher than at their lowest point during the last recession. In the last 12 months alone, rents in Louth have increased by over 8%, and this at a time when many people have been left out of pocket from the pandemic because of the impact on their employment or their business, and when other costs are also rapidly rising. But not only can our young people not afford the rent, many are lucky if they can even find a place to rent. Last week in Louth, for example, there were just 54 properties available to rent, and this is in a county with a population in excess of 130,000 and growing. Now, I think we should spare a thought for the young retail worker, the childcare worker, or single mother operating within this Hunger Games style rental market. You know, just imagine the feeling when they click onto a room to rent advert that has over 2,000 views, or when the prospective landlord tells them they had 500 plus other inquiries about a room, just about a room. And that's an experience I know that everyone across this chamber have experienced. They know that from representing their constituents day in, day out. And even if a person is lucky enough to get a viewing, they'll often be only one of many. And this desperation inevitably feeds into a diminution of standards, pushes up prices, as many have no choice but to accept the miserable offer that's available to them. And this isn't some distant reality. I know that in this very house, political staff, people working in our own national parliament, they're forced to live at home, unable to find even a room to rent at an affordable price. And this isn't to mention the skyrocketing cost of living and energy prices, which are making it nigh impossible for many renters to get by each month. It's no exaggeration when the head of Threshold, who are on the front line of a rental crisis, say many are forced to cut back on other essential expenditure, such as food or heat. That's the reality of life at the moment. Now, I remember 2012 and 2013 very well. The economy started to move again. Housing demand in cities and large towns grew. And remember that access to finance for builders hardly existed. It was hardly available. It wasn't that long ago. Access to skilled labour was very, very limited. Much of those skilled tradespeople had to emigrate to find work because of the economic situation we were in. Institutional investors were the only entities who were prepared to build at that point in time to any scale. But time does not stand still, and the time is long since passed for stronger regulation and fair taxation of these funds. This is not 2012, it's not 2013. The economic and financial situation is markedly different today. Yet instead, from 2016 to 2020, we saw that government add fuel to the flames of an overheating housing and rental market by allowing institutional investors a free rein, unencumbered, no change worth talking about in terms of the tax or regulatory regime applied to these funds. Last year alone, we saw large investors pay over €2 billion for nearly 5,000 private rented sector properties, with institutional buyers paying up to 32% more for each residence compared with the average price paid by household buyers in Ireland. And I am aware myself of situations in my own hometown of Drogheda where young first-time buyers were competing with funds for fairly modest former local authority homes, for example, homes that they might go in to start a family and then ultimately potentially move on. They could not compete because funds were buying up these properties en masse even before they were publicly advertised. We know the average first-time buyer simply can't compete with these funds, but a question I think that we don't ask ourselves too often is, why are the institutional investors willing to pay so much above what might be the market rate? In short, it's because they believe in Ireland's property market. They have the confidence that, with the odds heavily stacked in their favour, it is a safe bet. And I think that requires some reflection. We cannot allow institutional investors to continue to rake in virtually tax-free profits off the backs of workers in the real economy. And in successive budgets, the Labour Party has called for a package of measures to rein in cuckoo funds, including an increase of the dividend withholding tax to 33% on REITs and IREFs, a minimum 10% stamp duty levy on bulk sale of apartments to private investors, along with an increase in stamp duty on non-residential property and €1 million plus purchases. And we've also repeatedly called for the scrapping of CGT Section 604A relief, something which once may have served a purpose but is now costing the state more than €500 million in terms of tax expenditures. And this funding would not only help stem the dominance of institutional investors, but it would also serve as an important source of additional capital funding to local authorities and approved housing bodies. I want to briefly turn to the Labour Party amendment, which recognises the broader issue of the taxation of rental income. Now, we know that the vast majority of landlords, over 85%, own only one or two properties. These landlords, like the institutional investors, they have to be properly regulated. They are being properly regulated, and they have to be taxed to ensure a fair playing field for all, and taxed fairly and consistently. And the Labour Party believes this, like any other source of income, should be progressively taxed. We can't allow a situation to continue whereby those workers who pay the rent are liable for tax, while the landlord who collects it has a different experience. And that is the reality of the situation at present. Now, there will be scaremongering in certain quarters that this would lead to a further exodus of landlords from the property market, but there's absolutely no evidence whatsoever to back up this unsubstantiated claim. And also, when we look at the difference between mortgage repayments and the average rental costs, it is clear that the vast majority of landlords can well afford a modest tax on their rental income. Indeed, it would be foolish for them to leave for tax reasons alone. What we need to see is consistency. In our view, and as our amendment states, taxes on rental incomes should not be any less than the marginal tax rate levied on income from work. That is the fairest, most consistent and most equitable thing to do. So in closing, the Labour Party fully supports the principles of this motion, and we call on both opposition and government parties to accept our amendment to ensure full and fair taxation of rental income.
Thank you very much, Deputy Nash. Deputy Keane O'Callaghan.
Thank you, Cathaoirleach. Last Count Corla. Thank you, Count Corla. Firstly, I want to address a point that the Minister for Finance made in his remarks. And I don't think I need to explain this to the Minister for Finance. I'm sure he understands how social housing is costed in Budget 2022, which he introduced into the House, how it's costed in Housing for All, how it was costed, in fact, in all the budgets that he's introduced into this House. I would say he knows full well that the full capital cost of each social housing unit is not provided for in the budget, that the way that the government accounts for social housing costs is partially through capital payments and partially through loans, low-cost loans. That is the way it's provided for. So I think, given that, it's a bit unfair and a bit disingenuous to attack people on the opposition benches for using the exact same costings that he has introduced into this House on several occasions. Either he doesn't understand the costings that he's introduced into this House, or it was a cheap political attack. It's one or the other. Now, three things that are no longer the case in Ireland that were the case up until recently. Up until recently, it was cheaper to rent than to pay a mortgage. That's no longer the case. Up until recently, it was cheaper to buy a new build apartment than a new build house. That's no longer the case. And it's not so long that Ireland had above the average rate of home ownership in the European Union compared to other countries. Now we're below that. In fact, it's not terribly long that home ownership rates were at 80% in Ireland. But they've decreased steadily over the last number of years, especially since Fine Gael have come to office. And that's because of the policies that they are pursuing. The growth in investment funds, which has been facilitated and encouraged by the government, has gone hand in hand with rent increases of about 10% in the last year, according to the DAFT report, increases in house prices in the last year of 14%. It's gone hand in hand with the financialisation of housing, turning homes into assets. And it's gone hand in hand with the creation of generation rent, an entire generation who cannot afford to buy their own home even though they want to and are being forced into renting. It's gone hand in hand with the decline in home ownership that I was talking about. And that's particularly serious in an Irish context because our welfare state is very much based on home ownership. That's where a lot of the supports actually went in over the years. Our pensions are based on the idea that the vast majority of people will own their own home when they retire. And this is now, we're already seeing increasing numbers of pensioners at risk of homelessness and becoming homeless because they can no longer afford rents. That's going to become a bigger problem in coming years. I was particularly struck at the launch of Housing for All that the party leaders all talked about increasing home ownership. But if you actually look at Housing for All and look at the targets and look at what the government is doing in terms of attracting investment funds and attracting investment funds to buy up housing for rent, if Housing for All meets its targets, the only thing that will do to home ownership is will continue to push home ownership levels down and down further again. Housing for All is predicated on about a third of new homes going to owner-occupiers, about a third, and everything else to differing forms of rent, including a large amount of institutional landlords. So the truth is that the current trajectory of government policy is to continue to decrease home ownership. Part of the institutional landlords and their investment, part of it goes hand in hand with build to rent. And look at what's happened to apartment standards and sizes in recent years. In the last couple of years, the last 3 years in Dublin alone, apartment sizes of new build apartments have decreased by almost 20%. Apartment sizes have gone from 89 square metres in the second quarter of 2018 to just 62 square metres in the second quarter of 2021. That's the legacy of current policy. Look at the housing needs assessment of Dublin City Council and the analysis carried out by KPMG on behalf of Dublin City Council. They predict that in terms of new households formed between 2023 and 2028 in Dublin City and in the Minister's constituency, that only 18% of those new households formed will be able to afford to rent, and only 15% of those new households will be able to afford to buy a home. Everybody else is going to require either social housing or subsidised rents and supports. So almost 70% of new households will not be able to afford to meet their own housing needs. That is and look at their analysis and how that goes up. Year by year, the numbers that will be able to afford their own rent without subsidies or their own home to buy decreases year by year, as they predict rents are going to go up and up. The key feature of this is the uneven playing field that we have. And what we have since the Celtic Tiger collapse is we have, and rightly, we have mortgage lending rules that are very difficult and restrictive for people, but there is the advantage to them in terms of ensuring that they combat, house price inflation. But on the other hand, while individuals and families have those very restrictive rules, there's no such regulation or rules around investment funds, and that's the uneven playing field that we have, and that's what creates this unfairness. And clearly what we need is a regulatory regime on this that is fair, and we need rules written that are fair and that are actually to the advantage of individuals and families and are not to the advantage of investment funds. That's what is missing here. It's worth looking at the yields on apartments, which are largely owned by investment funds. And if you look at the recent DAFT report, it talks about yields on one-bed apartments in Dublin 1, in the Minister's constituency, at 8%. In Dublin 10, 10.3%. In my constituency, in Dublin 17, at 11.4%. They are staggering high annual yields. And that is the kind of environment that has been created for institutional investment funds by the very attractive tax treatment that has been put forward by the government. There's clearly no need for such levels of tax incentives and tax treatment with such high yields. And with yields that high, individuals cannot compete. And with yields that high, only one thing is going to happen as a result of yields that high, which is that the price of new build homes is going to continue to go up and up. There was an excellent report recently published by Daniela Gabor and Sebastian Cole, and was produced for the Greens group in the European Parliament. It's called The Financialisation of Housing in Europe. My home is an asset class. Now, I'm not used to quoting things from government parties in the Dáil or their European groupings, but this is an excellent report, so it's well worth quoting from. And they state in it that Europe's residential real estate has become an attractive asset class for investors worldwide, supported by a range of government policies that are ostensibly aimed at homeowners, but in fact push up house prices and reduce affordability for citizens. They go on to say that institutional ownership threatens to accelerate the trends unleashed by the financialisation of housing. Deeper financial markets have not substantially increased either aggregate home ownership or housing supply, but instead have inflated house prices. All this sounds very familiar in terms of Ireland. They also cite studies on both US and European cities which identify the role of investment funds having negative consequences for housing affordability. And they note that a report from the EU Commission on financialisation of housing in 7 European cities had a similar conclusion in terms of housing affordability. They go on to say that institutional investors hold back the supply of urban land, thus increasing housing shortages and driving up prices, as documented in relation to Ireland, of course. And importantly, they make the point that in relation to the regulatory side that happened after the financial collapse, that while substantive efforts to regulate global banking after the collapse of the Lehman Brothers happened, these have not been matched by similar policies to regulate systemic institutional investors. And that is the key problem here. There's rightly been tight controls over bank lending, which affects smaller builders, it affects individual families trying to buy. But that tight regulation has not been matched in terms of investment funds. In fact, there's been no tight regulation at all. And it's that imbalance that needs to be corrected urgently.
Thank you very much, Deputy O'Callaghan. Now we go to Richard Boyd Barrett. Deputy Barrett is sharing with Deputy Barry.
Yeah, 7.5 and 2.5. The Minister, like the utterly hopeless and disastrous situation that many working people find themselves in when it comes to trying to do the basic thing of putting a roof over their head was summed up this week for me by a young man who came in who is, works in retail. He's a low-paid worker, works in retail, worked all during the pandemic, and his partner is also in a sort of low-paid part-time employment, but both working, both trying to get on in life. And they came in to tell me that both of them were being removed from the housing list because they had gone over the income threshold. The combined income going very, very slightly over €35,000 net. Off the housing list, 11 years waiting. 11 years waiting. Now, I just want the Minister to think about this. First of all, if the state had discharged its obligation to them and the 5,000 other families in our area, and you can go on through the 100,000 across the country, they would now be in a council house, and regardless of what happened to their income, their rent would increase related to their income. They wouldn't be thrown out of the council house because their income increased. But ironically, because they don't have a home, because the state failed in its duty for 11 years to provide them with a home to which they were entitled, now that their income has risen, they are flung off the list. Now, do you get the injustice of that? In addition to that, I got another text this week, to a case I've raised 3 times in here, of a young woman who's also been thrown off the list. She's working for CPL, but actually working for a government agency, TUSLA, with very vulnerable children, worked all the way during the pandemic. She is in homeless accommodation with her daughter, and she's been thrown off the housing list. And by the way, when you get thrown off the housing list, you don't get HAP anymore. Now, in my area, when that happens to you, you are told to go out and find private rented accommodation. And the average rents that are being charged in my area now are €2,200. Just go on Daft, look for an apartment in my area, 2,200. Even if they were entitled to HAP, which now they're not, right? The maximum HAP rate is $19.50. That's if you're homeless, right? But they don't even get that now because their income apparently is too high. But that is what your friends, the build-to-rent, property investors, are delivering housing in my area at. And by the way, there's a lot of building going on in Dunleary at the moment, a lot. Are the prices going down? No, they're going up, right? And the entire response of the Minister is based on the fantasy, and often, you know, your side, I remember Michael Noonan always used to accuse us of fantasy economics on the left, right? But who's peddling the fantasy? Seriously, when the private sector was delivering 70 to 90,000 houses a year in this country, treble what it's delivering now, did rents go down? No, they went up. Did property prices go down? No, they went up. And as these SHDs are unfolding all over the city, built for profit, not built for need, not built for that couple that came in with me, but built to make money for property investors, charging €2,200. Or if you wanted to purchase a house, which is obviously a hopeless thing, for a couple earning just over €35,000 in my area, average house prices being delivered by your friends, the private sector, €560,000 in my area. Oh, but maybe your affordable housing scheme will help them. Capped at €450,000. I mean, when you initially brought that in, I thought, this is a joke. €450,000 an affordable home. You would need an income to get a loan on 80% of that, which is what your shared equity scheme involves. You'd need to get €360,000. To get a loan off a bank for that, you'd need to be earning between €100,000 and €120,000. Clearly, the couple who came into my home, or the vast, vast majority of ordinary workers, not a chance. Not a chance. But now it's got even worse, because there is no houses at €450,000, which was already unaffordable. Killian Woods in the Sunday Business Post do a report on your scheme and how it might apply in Dublin, and they found out of 50 developments happening in Dublin that they surveyed, only 4 of those 50 developments had any homes that were below €450,000. In my area, 0. 0. So what are you going to do about that fact? Because these people are building for profit. I missed the debate last night in Clareburn, but I'm glad we're finally debating socialism, even if it's a load of people, attacking the socialists. But at least we're debating it, right? Do you know what socialism means? Socialism means housing for need. Capitalism means housing for greed. And housing for greed delivers rents of €2,000 and €2,200, of affordable property prices of €450, but in actuality properties of €560,000. That's what housing for greed does. That's what capitalism does. And yet you peddle the fantasy that eventually the rents and the prices are going to fall. They're not going to fall. Right? It's a total fantasy. So what do we need to do? Well, we couldn't possibly do anything without these investment funds. I'm scratching my head about thinking about this, and I'm saying, Jesus, we managed to build council houses in the 30s, 40s and 50s and 60s without investment funds and cuckoo funds and vulture funds. How do we manage it then? But we did. But now you're telling us, no, we can't possibly do it without them. Or that we introduce rent controls. No, it will terrify them. They'll all run away if you introduce real rent controls to make rent affordable. Strangely enough, they've just done it in France. A transition year student who was doing her placement in my office this week found that out for me. Maybe you should look into it. Introduce rent controls where they're going to set maximum rents on a district-by-district basis. You can only charge a certain amount for a property of such size. Why can't we do that? All the property investors having to run away from France. I'll leave it at that. But honestly, Minister, your arguments are threadbare and your policy is failing disastrously.
Barry, please. Astonishing ruling today by the planning regulator in respect of blocking a city council from introducing some small degree of control on build-to-rent apartment blocks. What did Dublin City Council have the temerity to do? Number one, to insist that a percentage of apartments in build-to-rent developments be available for sale. Number two, to restrict the number of studio and one-bedroom apartments in any development. And number three, to say that build-to-rent developments should contain 100 units or more and be sufficiently large to include communal facilities. Now, this ruling, it is a win for big institutional corporate investors, and it is a blow. It is a blow both to communities and to local democracy in this state. How are ordinary people, ordinary communities, meant to have a say in the planning process when a city development plan can be overruled by a planning regulator in that way? I also want to make some points about what is happening with build-to-rent developments and the likes of this ruling, which gives them a free hand which will result in the raising of rents. No question. It's happening already in Dublin. It's beginning to happen in Cork. In Cork, a developer was told by Deloitte that if you want your apartments to be viable, in other words profitable, you're going to have to charge €2,800 for a two-bedroom apartment. In my own community of Blackpool, we have build-to-rent been given the go-ahead now on the Red Forge Road and an application in at Hewitt's Mill. Rents that go anywhere near that level is going to raise the ceiling for rents in that community, and there will be, of course, a tendency
for rents more generally to rise in the area. Does that mean that we are against housing? Absolutely not. We are for housing. We're for housing and apartments. But it should be social housing, it should be genuinely affordable housing, not rip off rents at incredible rates which raise the ceiling and impoverish ordinary people while making huge profits for the Vulture Funds.
Now we move to the regional group and Deputy Peter Fitzpatrick sharing with Deputy Peadar Tobin.
Yeah, thank you very much, Cairn. I very much welcome the opportunity to speak today. First of all, I would like to thank the deputies for bringing this motion to the House. I welcome the fact that we can discuss the housing crisis once more and discuss why we're in this position. In my hometown Dundalk, rental cost for a standard 3-bedroom house is anywhere between $1,200 and $1,600 per month. To service a mortgage on that property would be substantially less. But the fact of the matter is that the people paying the rent of between $1,200 and €1,600 per month are, most instances, not able to get a mortgage for the same property. In my opinion, this is one of the main reasons for the crisis we are in now. How is it that people who can afford to pay the rent can't get a mortgage? Minister, to me it makes no sense whatsoever. I have spoken before about this, and how is it unfair to those striving towards to get on the property ladder? We've heard today how many new homes and apartments are being purchased in bulk by real estate investment trusts and institutional investors. I agree this is a problem. They can outbid ordinary people for new properties, and there is no doubt that they are driving the price of houses up. They're also driving the price of rent up, which is not accessible. The fact is that real estate investment trusts and Irish real investment funds pay no corporation tax on rental income or capital gain tax on disposal of assets from their rental income businesses is wrong. Minister, why are this allowed to happen? As this motion states, it is having a detrimental effect on the Irish residential property market and private rental sectors. These institutions should no longer have these tax advantages, and they are competing with first-time buyers in the property market. Their tax advantage should be abolished as a matter of urgency. They are the distorting rental and property markets to families who are really struggling very, very hard at the moment to buy their own house. A recent report by the BNP Real Estate stated that 4,900 private rental sector properties were bulk purchased by investment properties funds in 2021 at an average of 32% above the asking price. The value of these investments is estimated at €2.27 billion, and unless action is taken, it is expected to grow even more in the coming years. How can ordinary families and workers compete against these institutions? In relation to the motion today, I agree that legislation needs to be introduced to end the tax advantages and exemptions that have been granted to institutional investments, including real estate investment trusts and Irish real estates. Why is today's institution have these advantages? There is no justification for it. One area we need to have a look at is that of vacant homes in Ireland. I have spoken many times on this issue and have repeatedly highlighted the issues in my own hometown of Dundalk. I can guarantee you that you can walk down any residential area in Dundalk and you're sure to find at least one vacant property. Minister, how is this allowed? These properties are generally well established in residential areas where the necessary services are already in place. I have highlighted this before that worked at Louth County Council in bringing these vacant properties back into the housing stock. I know from dealing with the Council that these schemes have been very successful, and the only thing that's holding the Louth County back is the lack of funds from the government. Surely the government can see the success of these schemes, and would it not be better to fund these schemes instead of affording unfair tax advantages to institutional investors and trusts? Recent data really showed that there are 44,905 residential and commercial properties lying vacant in the west, north, west and border areas like my own constituency of Louth. The government-owned target states that we need 33,000 new homes on an annual basis. Surely the way forward is to tackle these vacant homes first and bring back to the market. As we already stated, many of these vacant homes are in established residential areas where services like schools, shops, medical and so on exist. We need to focus on vacant homes issues, which in turn will dramatically help the housing crisis. Minister, people want to go onto the property ladder. I don't like what I'm hearing in my constituency office. What I'm hearing now, Minister, and it's a long time to the header, is I have people coming to my constituency office saying that they're better off on social welfare. Minister, please don't go down that road again. A married couple coming in on the basic wages earn between 35 and maybe 40,000. The local authorities hasn't changed the limits on council lists for the last 10 years, Minister. So I'm trying to say, Minister, it's totally unfair that they're coming into me and they're saying to me, listen, Like, you know, we're earning, we're out working and we want to work. We're paying 1,200 to 1,600 euros a month for rent. We're coming home maybe 25 or 30,000 after they pay the taxes and the university social charges. They're left with absolutely nothing. If they give up the job tomorrow morning, they would get 1,320 euros towards the HAP. They would get medical cards, they would get everything, Minister, and it only costs them 25 euros per week for the house. Minister, please don't forget the working people. They're right there at the moment is, and that's I'm saying 35,000. And then what happens to the children and crash? Minister, please, all I'm asking is look after the middle class people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deputy Tobin.
Minister, the crisis in the cost of living for people across the country is at an extreme level at the moment. Utility bills are going through the roof at the moment. Many people are getting bills landing on their mat that are 600, 700, 800, 900 euros in value. Most families don't have that kind of cash lying around for such bills, and some families are going into debt to try and cover the cost of those bills at the moment. And the amount of people who've contacted my offices across Westmeath and Meath over the last couple of weeks and details the increases in their bills is incredible. Just one household saw their gas bill go from 91 euros to 206 just from one bill to another. Another Energia bill went from 156 to 342. A gas bill went from 280 euros to 620. Another family said that they were paying 864, where they were spending 209 euros on their electricity. And one family is spending 1,200, a bill for 1,200 euros come in for gas and electricity at a single moment in time. And those types of bill increases puts the so-called supports that the government came up with last week into the halfpenny place. And the truth of the matter is that the spending power of the average income in this state has fallen from about 2,000 euros in the space of a year. And that's a significant fall. And when you put that reduction in salary, in real terms, of the general public, in comparison to the largesse of the government when giving a 100,000 euro increase to the private secretary of the Department of Health, it just shows you how in this country it's a tale of two countries. There is two parallel experiences and existences happening under Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael in this state. Now, you know, the government has been great in saying, well, actually, these price increases are as a result of external issues. But the truth of the matter is, if you look at Ireland, Ireland is now the 6th most expensive state in the EU. Dublin is the 3rd most expensive city in the whole of Europe. Only 2 Swiss cities now outcost Dublin currently. So we have a cost of living crisis that is affecting so much. It's affecting families' ability to pay for their bills and to live. But it's also affecting this country's ability to compete internationally. Because if the cost of living goes out of control with runaway inflation rates in this state, what you're going to see is our inability to compete with other European countries and other locations internationally for jobs and for investments in the future. So it is working against our long-term economic interests as well. And the issue is certainly getting worse. And you know, the problem I have is that the government has a number of opportunities, a number of levers in its own hands in which they refuse to operate. I have asked you, Minister, a dozen times why you won't find a tax for houses that are vacant at the moment in this state. And in committee and here in the Dáil, you have said that you want to find out more about it. You don't want to rush into it. There could be loads of other reasons. But what you've displayed is a complete lack of urgency where urgency is required. You know, the issue of childcare is literally hammering so many families at the moment. It's equivalent to a second mortgage. And I've been talking to people in the industry today who tell me that the Minister and the Taoiseach are going out in public saying that there will be a cap on childcare prices in this state, and in actual fact still have not come to any negotiation or any deal with the childcare sector themselves. So they haven't told the childcare sector what level of income they're going to receive from the state, and yet they're publicly saying that the childcare sector is not going to increase the cost of childcare in the future. We are still massively behind other European countries with the level of investment that we're making into childcare. And then, of course, you have the issue of the litre of fuel at the pumps. 60% of that goes into the government's pocket. You have a government which is introducing carbon taxes on a population years in advance, completely oblivious to the conditions that those people will be experiencing at that time, with one of the blindest and most blunt taxes that I've ever seen. And yet, you're going to add that on to the cost of living crisis in May. Sinn Féin, Gurmila Mahagat, Can Corley.
Now we go to the Rural Independent Group. Deputy Michael Collins sharing with his colleagues.
Thank you very much, Ken Corley. Last week's announcement by Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael Green Government showed one thing, Minister, is that you are alarmingly out of touch in this country. It is astonishing to think you could go ahead with cuts so-called to help people and still be so blind to the real crisis out there in this country, where we see working families in such a crisis and such a mess. People can't pay rents, people are struggling to pay mortgages, people are struggling to put food on the table. As Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and the Greens have most families with a clear choice now every day in this country: food or heat. You with Sinn Féin, Labour and others here voted to bring in carbon tax only a few months ago, even that the Rural Independent Group pleaded with you not to. And boy, what a mess you have created for ordinary families who are trying to work their way out of the crisis we are in at the moment. Sorry, apologies. At the moment, with no help from a struggling government. So €200 off the ESB bill is as much as most families get. The rest is tied up in a dream announced that will have little to do with the ordinary families that I know. Oh yes, I forgot. The 20% decrease public transport will suit, of course, the Greens to perfection, as travellers in Dublin that use the Dart, the train, the Luas in Dublin City and its surrounds will benefit the most, and anyone who travels in a bus, air and bus. But for the private bus operator, who employs people with no state intervention, who drives buses the length and breadth of this island, many of those from West Cork to Cork City daily, will not get 1 brown cent of the 20% decrease, which for many private bus providers will lead to the laying off of staff, as you, as a blinded government, are giving an already subsidised bus service 20% more subsidy, and the private bus operator zero. Surely the competition regulator has to get involved here. To be honest, if you were all asleep, you could not write up this stuff. People who are paying massive rents, business people with lorries, buses, contractors, can't wait to drag this government to the ballot box as soon as we can to simply get rid of it. Also, people who can't get on the property market for one reason or another feel rightly let down after last week's announcements.
Thank you very much. To thank Sinn Féin, and in particular people like Owen O'Brien and Pearse Doherty for the work that they put into this matter. We don't always agree 100% on everything, and I would question their support of some of the carbon taxes, but I know that this motion is nothing but a sincere attempt at trying to highlight the problems that we have. This is no longer a Dublin crisis. This is a country crisis. And indeed, the government are doing nothing whatsoever, in my humble opinion, to sort it. And I'll tell you why. First of all, I will declare an interest in all of this matter, these type of matters, as I always do. But when you look at what the way the culture has been made to suit the massive institutional investors that come in from abroad, the fact that they are able to shelter so much money from tax, and that they can buy up hundreds and hundreds of units at the same time. Of course, that is not good at the end of the day for the person who's renting. That is one of the contributing factors as to why rents have gone up so much. And it has also made it why it is so expensive for people who want to get on the property ladder and buy, whether it is an apartment or a house, not just in Dublin, because again, this is not a Dublin problem. This is a countrywide problem. There is more to Ireland and more to the housing crisis than inside the Red Cow. We live outside the Red Cow as well, and we are entitled to live there, and we have a housing crisis. We in County Kerry have a housing crisis. Every clinic that I go to, every day, every hour that will pick you up the phone, it's people who are in trouble, it's the people themselves, it's the mothers and the fathers, it's the grandparents saying, what are we going to do? And whatever in the name of God has happened this March, but the amount of people that have been given notices, and I've checked every one of them, some of them fall through the net and they're not proper, but the majority of them are done properly. The notifications telling a young couple perhaps that you have to leave your home. And it is fine, but where are we supposed to go? Sorry, I'm out of time.
I too want to support the motion here, and it's a matter of the ordinary people can't afford to both heat their houses, live in their houses, put the children in childcare in schools, and they're like to the pin of the collar. I said it last week, do you want to starve them out and die in the ditches? It's shocking. And if the red carpet rolled out, and we saw the bank bailout, now the red carpet's out for these institutional investors. They can buy streets and they can buy housing estates, and we're persecuting our own people. Our duty in here as Talkty Downey, as servants of the people, messengers of the people, to represent the people and to speak up for them. And you've lost sight of the ordinary people. You don't seem to care about them, you don't seem to understand empathy. I want to thank the staff of my office, and all offices are overrun with people coming in with all kinds of issues. HAP was a disaster. We now have billions spent on HAP, and we have near a house. It was a stupid policy, and we continue with it and still continuing with it. And I also want to say that, look, where spending power is way down. As I said, the people of the sixth most expensive country in Europe. How come Sweden could bring down the price of fuel, bring it down to 2018 levels? We can't do anything. And as I said last week, 170 for a gallon of petrol, €1 of it goes on taxes. This is shocking. And carbon taxes, we brought forward a motion here. I proposed it there, and 9 other people, independents, voted. Sinn Féin included, voted for it. So we can't have it both ways. And we're going to have another increase coming up now again in carbon tax. The people just can't afford to live. And the ordinary, hard-working, decent people, no services in rural islands. There was a laugh last week to say 20% reduction in public transport. That's lovely for the Luce and for the Dats and all the other people. What about the people out in countries? What about the Ring-a-Link people that use the Ring-a-Link services and other services in rural islands? So look, I'm supporting this motion, but I'm aghast at what's going on.
Ceann Comhairle. Minister, I'm happy to have the opportunity to speak on this very important issue. We know that people are really, really struggling and getting it very hard, particularly working families, to make ends meet. I will say at the outset, though, that I have no intention in engaging in a game whereby any or all private investment in the housing market is automatically a bad thing, because I don't feel that that's the case, and that is an absurd position to adopt. What I will say, however, is that, like so many areas, it is a matter of proportion and balance. For example, we should be rewarding and helping the small contractor and the local builder who want to tender for contracts with a local authority, so that they can provide homes for their communities and build up their workforce, thereby offering much valuable local employment. And that is an issue that we must get to grips with. How we allow the small contractor who can provide work and who can build houses to effectively tender for state contracts. These people have their roots in communities, and they do actually have something valuable to offer in terms of the local economy and in terms of much needed employment. It is evident that there is a major power imbalance, and unfortunately all the power is on one side. In many ways, these large institutional investors do have us over a barrel. They know we have a housing crisis. The state is slow to build, and so they come in offering manna from heaven in the form of much-needed homes. But then the prices are simply made out of the reach of so many homeowners or potential homeowners and young couples and ordinary workers. We must address the distorting element of all of this, particularly for the rental and property markets, which, as the motion says, is to the detriment of workers, families and struggling home buyers.
Thank you very much, Ceann Comhairle. I'm glad to get the opportunity, and I want to thank Sinn Féin for bringing this very important debate forward. I agree with the motion, but I have a different angle that I just want to raise. I mean, we're talking about tackling the cost of living. The cost of living has gone up exorbitantly because of the cost of fuel, diesel, petrol, home heating oil. And we know that this has gone up worldwide, but the tax take is bigger, Minister, he's gone. The tax take that you have now has increased, and I'm asking you again to forego that increase and give it back. Give the working people a chance. In rural Ireland, you have to travel to work, and to do that you need to have a car, regardless of what Eamon Ryan thinks about his bicycles and these other things. You need a car to go to work. Transport costs have gone through the roof. No heed given to the lorrymen and the plight that they're in. And we should, the diesel rebate, I asked you to increase that. It should be increased. And forego the extra. And what are they trying to do? Raise the carbon tax again? Farmers' diesel costs are doubled, fertiliser costs are tripled. Because the Greens hate the farmer, he'll do nothing for him. And God and his mother knows that the cost of food will go up when the farmers' costs go up. I want to raise another thing. A poor old man rang me there today, and he rang this SEAI about their wonderful proposals and grants or whatever for heating homes. He asked about the SEAI, he asked them to see what was he entitled to. They looked at his address and his date of birth, and they said, look, you got a grant for attic insulation about 10 years ago, and you got a grant for to fill the cavity wall. And he wanted outside and inside insulation. They told him he will not qualify. Right. Listen, Minister, give up your codding people like that and driving them mad. They're on the phone ringing, see what's wrong, and just because they got 500 or 600 euros, maybe 7 or 8 or 10 years ago, they'll get nothing now. But
all right, time is up, Deputy. Thank you very much.
But what do you want to do? Rise the carbon tax to drive the thing further, mad and out of people's control.
Thank you very much, Deputy Healy-Rae. Now, Deputy Marion Harkin.
Thank you, Can Corla.
It's very, very hurtful to the rural independent group on behalf of Matthew McGrath that the minute Deputy College started, that the Minister for Finance went out the door. That's very, very unfair. Is it that we're not entitled to have the Minister inside here?
No, I mean, ministers will have to come and go because they've lots of duties apart from sitting here. So please.
We'll go away now. We'll go away now when the Minister came, and just to say that it's bad manners, Minister.
Thank you very much, Deputy. Deputy Harkin.
Thank you, Can Corla. I'm not quite speaking to an empty doll, but anyway. First of all, can I thank Sinn Féin for bringing forward this motion, which comes forward with a number of proposals to tackle the cost of living in the context of institutional investors in the residential property market. I think all of us in this House would agree that the provision of homes to buy and homes to rent, is beyond crisis point. And this issue is not new. This crisis has been escalating year on year. And it is not a crisis manufactured by any opposition party. It's a real crisis for families, for individuals, for young people, for pensioners. And it's a crisis that affects urban and rural areas alike. Being able to call somewhere home, I think, is essential to ensuring a sense of security that is fundamental to all of us as human beings. Being able to open, step through, and close your own front door behind you gives those of us in that position a real sense of belonging and a sense of place. And just that sense, we're at home. Because that word home is so, so powerful, and it means so much in so many different ways. Without a home, either one you own or one that you rent with some decent level of certainty around your tenancy. Without that, as a person, as a family, you're just adrift. You have no anchor. And all the other things that we talk about in this place, whether it's employment or education or community, they're all irrelevant if you don't have a home. And that's why we speak of a crisis. At one time, this crisis was much more acute in the cities, in urban areas. But of course, if you're a person without a home, it's acute no matter where you live. But certainly, the numbers were greater. But that's no longer the case, because if we look at the facts, we can see that, excluding the cities, the average rent increases across the country in the last year stands at just over €1,100, sorry, not the increase, the actual rent is €1,100, just over per month. That's an increase of 11.9% on the previous year. But in the west of Ireland, in counties like Roscommon and Leitrim and Mayo, rents rose by 20% on a year-on-year basis. So that's 8% more than the average I spoke of. Indeed, Minister, 4 of the 5 largest annual increases in the country were in the western region, if we look at Q2 in 2021, with increases of 21% in Leitrim, 17% in Clare and Donegal, and 15% in Sligo. Now that's looking at increases in the cost of renting a home. But if we look at the cost of buying a home, house prices, what we see is that the move away from the larger urban centres has had a hugely significant impact. If we look at median house prices, the percentage change from 2019 to 2021 is 11% in Donegal, 16% in Leitrim, 8% in Sligo, and 14% in Roscommon. Now, I could be giving you stats and figures all day long, but that doesn't give you a real picture of what it's like for people who are trying to buy a home. And I, like many others in this chamber, get emails and calls from people all the time. At the end of their tether, they cannot find a place to rent or a place to live. Now, government tells us, and there's a lot of truth in it, that the problem is one of supply. But if we look at the completions in the last 3 years, 2019, 2020, 21, we see that in the western region, the numbers are paltry, from just over 2,600 completions in 2019 to 2,758 in 2021. And in my own county of Sligo, the completions were 118 in 2019 and 143 in 2021. That's a minuscule, tiny increase. Yes, I know we have COVID, and we have to, obviously, that has impacted on the number of completions. But your government tells us this is a problem of supply, and you're the government, and you have to find a solution to that. Now, many of the proposals in this motion, I think, will help to start addressing the crisis that we're speaking of here. But I want to focus particularly on one, and that's the last proposal, which asks that you would provide additional capital funding to local authorities and approved housing bodies to forward purchase such developments for the provision of social, affordable rental and affordable purchase homes. Given, as they say, some developments require forward purchase agreements to ensure their viability and delivery. Now, to me, this is a really important issue because the upfront costs of developing and building homes can be very significant. And I think one of the things we could do, for example, is to look to the housing agency to fund the upfront costs of the mezzanine funding that's necessary, to local authorities, to approved housing bodies. But I also believe that we should look at the same housing agency to lend money for what I would call genuine projects, for the building of homes, where the outcome would ensure affordable homes. Because there's no point in government money fuelling the costs of homes or the increase in the cost of homes. We have a housing agency that is managing the MICA redress scheme. Why don't we task that agency with managing what I'm speaking of here, the upfront costs to local authorities, approved housing bodies, or to local builders and developers who will provide local homes in local areas and local employment. I think that proposal perhaps needs some refinement, but I think it's a really valuable one because it deals with the reality of building homes. I would finally say, Minister, that during COVID, we did a lot of good things. You did a lot of good things. You guaranteed businesses. We guaranteed the banks during the crash. But what we're talking about here today is bread and butter stuff. And my question is, why can we not guarantee housing? And I suppose the final point I make, again, comes back to local authorities. And we know that local authorities built houses 20, certainly 30, 40, 50 years ago. Unfortunately, because policy changes, some of the expertise has been lost, and it will take time to get that back. But there's still a lot could be done, Minister. For example, with derelict homes in towns and villages. I know that there are grants for individuals to perhaps do up these houses, but why not resource local authorities to help to deliver local housing in this way? Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy. We return now to Government and the Minister to respond.
Thank you very much, Cathaoirleach, and I've listened very carefully to many of the deputies opposite in their very well-intentioned arguments put forward in connection with the increase in the cost of living. And I too, as a rural TD in Longford Westmeath, through my weekly clinics, meet very vulnerable people every single week that I attend Dáil Éireann here and right through the year. People who come in that are trying to find a solution, that are looking for hope, and that really want support in a very vulnerable time in their lives. So one thing I want to make very clear from the outset is that, I'm meeting very difficult situations, very vulnerable people, and I am doing my best as part of a government response, trying to provide sustainable and real, genuine solutions for those people. I think if we look in broad terms, in the first instance, of where we are currently with a new plan to deliver large-scale residential homes for our citizens right across the state, right out to 2030. And we've seen small incremental progress, but if you look at the big numbers right over since 2016, we've increased the delivery of social homes tenfold. Those are real solutions for people right across the state. Coming from an extremely low base where 2/3 of our construction sector workers had left the state, where our economy was spending 50% more than it took in an income, where we had 3,000 ghost estates in a department where I am now serving, trying to implement remedial schemes up and down the country, to now where we have a very clear plan-led direction for our country, whereby we now have a new national planning framework to deliver and unlock the potential right across our state for all our citizens. And I think when you look at the housing plan, 4 billion multi-annual funding guaranteed to give certainty into the marketplace and into the state in delivering viable solutions. And when you see in terms of the large-scale increase in affordable purchase and also our cost rental model providing certainty for citizens at 25% below market rent, those are real solutions. And if you look at this city here tonight, over the last 4 years, 33% of a reduction in the social housing list. That is progress. And I know many will criticise the pace and it should be done faster. But the circumstances that the government are operating in, there are huge challenges, but it is making progress. And when we refer and look around and see that commencement notices, 31,000 units now commenced. That is a huge 42% improvement on 2020. And again, those are real solutions for families up and down this state and will, as they can see now, provide huge hope. I know in my own locality, when I see people coming in and out of my clinic, I can point to 4 or 5 individual sites in my town with over 100 units being delivered on them. That's hope for people because the diggers are there, the tradespeople are there delivering those houses, and they are coming. And I know it is very difficult to get to that space, but they are being delivered at scale. And in terms of a cross-government approach, when you see in terms of the way we have supported the most vulnerable in our society towards defraying the cost of living increases, from, in the first instance, increasing the state pension at a time when inflation was not as high, but then more targeted measures like our fuel allowance payment, like our drugs payment scheme, again supporting people on the front line who need it most. And on a broader base then for people who are struggling, two-income families or middle-income earners, they have the energy payment, as well as the reductions that were taken from our tax, our standard rate cut-off point and increase in tax credits over the budgetary process. And like, if you look at a party that I'm a member of, increased the minimum wage by 37% over the last number of years. We put a priority on taking 35% of workers out of the tax net because they are the most vulnerable people in our society, and a party that I am a member of saw the deprivation index currently reduce because we're supporting people who are the most vulnerable in our society by those targeted measures, by increasing housing supply, by supporting those in most need through the measures that I referenced, and also ensuring that those in a progressive tax system who do not earn as much do not pay any tax. And I always remember when you saw the Controller and Auditor General's report where it said, and many people always quote different figures, in black and white, that the effective tax rate for high net worth individuals was over 40%. And when I was a member of the Public Accounts Committee, that was very clear in page 249, I won't forget it, of that report. And when you hear discourse in this House, sometimes you would think that there's this magic number of people earning huge, colossal amounts of money at the expense of the state and paying no tax. Well, the research and the evidence does not back that up, and you can see that in the Controller and Auditor General's report. And I would point out, Cathaoirleach, as we go through in terms of trying to ensure that people have real solutions, we see other parties who promise and talk in what they will do. But if you look in terms of what they said and promised compared to what this government did, we have exceeded many of what particularly the party opposite had said, and particularly in terms of their house number delivery of 36,500 in your 2016 manifesto, when the government actually delivered 39,000 houses a year earlier. And when I look in our analysis and I see mama and papa landlords exiting the marketplace, 16,000 since 2016, and I look at Sinn Féin looking to put a €400 second homes charge on those people that are trying to make ends meet as well and trying to deliver sustainable rental accommodation. That's your response to a market that's in crisis, is tax it more. And when I see and look around in terms of housing developments and all the objections that are trying to be delivered from Sinn Féin again, time after time, and we saw public houses exclusively on public land in Kilbride Lodge in Wicklow objected to by Sinn Féin. But also in terms of a time when we were trying to prioritise employment, and we saw how the Minister for Finance really underwrote employment, supported people right through the crisis, be it the EWSS, the CRIS scheme, rates waivers, to ensure that people did not lose that vital link with their job. Sinn Féin was proposing to increase employers' PRSI, put a greater tax on people being employed, and in turn have a no-risk assessment, and at a time when the government was spending billions trying to maintain that link between the employer and the employee, their response was to tax them more. And when you look again in terms of the various mechanisms that are being proposed opposite, increasing stamp duty by 66%. You know, if you're a small business owner and you're expanding, how is that going to fare up with you trying to get into a new premises or expand your business? If you're a farmer trying to consolidate your holdings, how will that affect you? Because not everyone qualifies for the minority of reliefs that sometimes you hear referenced in some of the debates that Sinn Féin go on with. But again, you have to support people with the best use of public resources. And when you're in government, you know, you really have to make decisions. And decisions are difficult because you're trying to balance competing interests every day of the week. And that's something I do not take lightly. It's a privilege that I'm humbled to be part of a government that is doing its very best, because I know the background I come from, I know the people I meet week in, week out at my clinic, and I can genuinely say every day in government you do your very best to take the best decisions for the best interest of the public at heart. And by the measures that I've referenced that we have done, we are doing our very best to do that. But in any debate, I think we should never take away hope, because numbers back up the fact that we are now at a huge capacity in our construction sector. We can see that we're getting more apprenticeships back in through Minister Harris in the further and higher education. We can see, as I said, that her output in terms of completions forecasted by the central bank over the next number of years is going to exceed 30,000 and get to that figure of 33,000 that the ESRI say we should need, and hopefully exceed that. And we're working so hard to deliver that across all tenures. But, you know, people can come into this House and identify many different problems, but people on the other benches are trying to do their best to meet one of the biggest challenges we've ever faced in housing, coming from a position, I remember, where all our local authorities were saturated in debt back less than a decade ago. I think the measures that we're doing, and even bringing vacant properties back into use, and signalling now to the marketplace that, you know, through our zone land tax, to our value capture sharing tax potentially coming down the line shortly, that we mean business in delivering large numbers of homes for the most vulnerable and for every part of society, because it has to be a broad base to deliver homes all across our economy. Thank you, Cathaoirleach.
Thank you, Minister. I'll return to Sinn Féin. I'm afraid my screen has gone blank. Who's leading the Sinn Féin response on this?
Myself and Morris have 5 minutes between us, and then...
Here's the 5.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Cathaoirleach. I have 2.5 minutes, so I'll be brief. I want to mention the issue of rents, and obviously loads of people have mentioned that, but it really is, like, I don't even like to use the word crisis point, because it's just gone beyond that nearly at this stage. But just both yesterday in the 2 clinics that I run, one in Kilkenny City and one in Bagnallstown, which is in Carlow, I had an individual in each, one actually due to be out of their property this Saturday and one in the next 2 months, and just absolutely no hope of being able to find anything at all. And it's really, really so difficult, and it's really difficult even to know what to say to people sometimes in this situation, because, you know, you're saying, have you applied to various landlords or anything that might be coming up, and everybody's applying to everything. And at the moment there's 10 properties in the whole of Kilkenny and 9 in the whole of Carlow, and then you put into a situation where people are entitled to HAP. For example, if you're a single person, 490 HAP is what you're entitled to. Like, you haven't a hope of reaching some of these properties listed at between 1,100 and 1,500 euro in some cases. So we really, really do need urgency in relation to the rental. And it's not everyone that qualifies for HAP, and I want to make that point too. There's a lot of people in real difficulty that don't qualify for any supports. I want to mention the fuel allowance as well, because this is a major, major issue in relation to the costs of living. And so many people we have seen, particularly elderly people, who should be not worried about the cost of heating, are really, really, you know, under pressure. And there's an awful lot of people that don't qualify for fuel allowance, and I want to mention that in particular too. And one of our suggestions was to include people who are on the work and family payment, for example, and I think we need to look at that. In the longer term as well, I think we need to look at the issue of retrofitting. I know this will be a debate later this week in this chamber, but I just want to make the point, while I have the opportunity, that a lot of the grants that are out there are not fit for purpose. People don't have the balance of the funds, and I think the SEIA have a waiting list of around a year or over a year at the moment, which is crazy for people. So some of the schemes, there's no common sense in them, and they need to really be fit for purpose. And that's, you know, where we should be looking at if we want to long-term reduce costs for people, and also if we really are serious about the climate. They're the kind of schemes that we need to be looking at. I'll finish there, Cathaoirleach, because I know we're short on time.
Thanks very much, Cathaoirleach. Minister, the average rent in my home city of Limerick is €1,407 per month. That's if you're lucky enough to be able to find a property. Today there was 9 properties available on daft.ie. 2 of those houses were for more than 4,000 a month. I don't know who can actually afford that in Limerick. But there's only one house available for less than €2,000 a month. So we have actually priced working families out of the market. They have nowhere to go. They earn too much to get a social support. You refuse to increase the limit of the income limit where people can actually access social supports, whether that be a council house or HAP. You refuse to do that. There's a supposedly review going on in the department, but any official I've spoken to tells me there is no review going on, or there's no particular review or no time plan on when that's going to be done. Minister Burke referenced, addressing the cost of living, and he spoke about the minimum wage. Yeah, you increased the minimum wage by 3% this year. That's 3%, and inflation is running at 5%, so it's actually a reduction. So you haven't really done anything to help people who are on the very lowest pay. The extreme cost of rent and house purchases has not come out of the blue. It's a result of failure after failure of this government and its predecessors. The refrain we hear most from government parties is that housing is not an issue that can be fixed overnight, but stick with them and they will deliver. We've had 11 years of failure in relation to the cost of housing by these parties, and I think it's time to realise that these parties cannot and will not fix the crisis of their own making. Yesterday, your colleagues in Fianna Fáil tried a social media attack on Sinn Féin and your housing policies with which was fairly pathetic attack on social media. So let's get something straight here. Your colleague, constituency colleague of mine, Deputy RD, was quoted in the Sunday Times when talking to investors, social housing that the government will offer incentives, and in his own words, and I quote, "In this world, everybody has to make a few bob, you know." Money to be made while Irish citizens were locked out of the housing and rental markets. Now, I'm sure Fianna Fáil will produce some more of their pathetic little graphics for social media to suggest that we in Sinn Féin are the problem when it comes to housing, which of course is nonsense. But let's be clear on a few points. The government have not delivered affordable homes to rent or to buy on the scale that is needed. Under this government, both rents and house prices have increased, working families priced out of the market. The tax advantages and exemptions to investment funds were not gifted by Sinn Féin. The rich got richer and made, as Deputy D suggested, more than a few bob. It was under this government's watch that 4,900 private rented sector properties were bulk purchased by investment funds in 2021. My time is up, so I could have contributed more.
Well, Chairperson, in the past hour we've heard the usual excuses in welfare's defence now from government, something that hasn't changed in the years that I've been raising this with them. But I'll tell you something, if there was any investors, any cuckoo funds or vulture funds watching into the contributions made by Minister Paschal Donoghue and Mr Burke, they'll be happy enough anyway, because they know their lads have their back in Fine Gael, because there's nothing going to change according to the two lads here. Indeed, Minister Paschal Donoghue's speech went as far as to try and convince us all that the vulture funds are poor souls that are just trying to do the best for ordinary renters and home purchasers out there, and we should maybe shed a tear for them. But the reality is something very, very different. And the fact that the Minister for Finance didn't even talk about the fact that they don't pay any corporation tax or capital gains tax shows that there is no defence in terms of the sweetheart deals that he has given and his colleagues have given these funds over the last number of years. One of the myths peddled by the government and again by the Minister this evening is that these funds finance residential developments that would otherwise be built. But this isn't the first time we've heard this. He's said it numerous times before. Indeed, his party leader, the Taoiseach, told the Dáil that the role of these funds is to finance the construction of developments which would not have been built if it not for finance from the investment funds. Such developments were not able to get funding from banks. That's what he told this House. It is blatantly untrue. As Hook and McDonald estate agents noted in a recent Dublin residential investment report, very few institutional investors have funded the development and construction of properties that they bought in the Irish market. That is the truth. Not what Paschal Donoghue is saying, not what Leo Varadkar is saying, not the spin that's coming from this government. Last week we got a report from BNP Paribas, and that found that investment funds bulk purchased 4,900 properties in 2021 alone, and they were paying 32% more than the average asking price. 32% more because they believe that rents are going to stay at the levels that they are. Properties which we know are now being rented out at extortionate price, and they are extortionate, and that is the word for them. But Peter Burke wants us to shed a tear if you would even think of that. They have to pay €400 more, given that they don't pay any tax whatsoever. These funds have more firepower than ordinary workers and families out there. So if you care, then do something about it. They have more firepower, and the problem is that it's not just that. You are making things worse. You have given them more firepower because the policy of the government is to give you the greater advantage over workers and families, and that's the blunt truth about it. There's no hiding place from this here. Even Home Building Finance Ireland, which is wholly owned by the Minister for Finance across the Dáil floor here, it was set up by the government to finance residential development. It has provided €264 million in funding for 5 developments, 916 units that have been or are to be bought up by these same funds. So just get this for a moment. Get this for a moment. We have the taxpayers funding over €250 million to a developer to build homes. Those homes never come on the market. The funds buy them right from the start. agree to buy them. They charge eye-watering rents of €2,000 plus, and all of those million euros that they get from those rental incomes, the Minister for Finance across the floor, and with the support of Fianna Fáil and the Green Party, are saying you do not have to pay 1 cent, not even 1 cent of tax on that. Any other company, any other individual would have to pay tax on that rental income. But you think that they should have special privilege to boost up rental prices and house prices, allow them to pay over 32% the asking prices, pushing up house prices on everybody, and then you try to convince us that you have at the heart, at the core of your policy is ordinary renters, workers or families. Nothing can be further than the truth, because these policies only serve one purpose, and that is to serve the funds. In May 2020, the Dublin-based investment advisory firm Gillen Markets wrote a note to international investors on our housing market and why it's broken. So this is what they said, and Minister Donoghue knows what they said, but this is what they said. Current housing policy has benefited both institutions and developers at the expense of individual buyers. The aims of institutions is to maximise its rental income from its properties, and developers are also designing apartment blocks to maximise this income for the institutions, rather than aiming to meet the needs of society. It went on to say that the current high level of house prices and rents in Ireland's residential property market has been driven in a significant way by government housing policy, with favourable policies attracting institutional investors into the market. It went on to say that their gradual move into the market has contributed to higher housing prices and higher rents. Not my words, not Sinn Féin words. This is the market talking to itself, exposing what you and Fine Gael, what your government has done over the last 10 years. You've rolled out the red carpet, you have given them more firepower to push up prices on ordinary people, and the public can no longer stand for it. It is crazy what is happening. It is crazy what is happening. And people out there, if you really get it, are pleading with you to take away that advantage from the funds. Why and under God would you allow them to be outbidding ordinary families who are desperate and needed for homes? Why would you allow that to do it? You do it every time, but you didn't address that once in your 10-minute contribution, or indeed your 10-minute contribution. Not once did you justify why you allow them to pay no tax, why you allow them to outbid ordinary people, ordinary families, and why they are allowed to push up rents in this city across the board. This motion should be supported by anybody who has the interests of workers and families at heart, instead of those who support the profits of these funds.